Imagine a world without modern science to explain the cosmos, without formalized religion as we understand it today, no psychologists to decipher the human mind, and often no clear political blueprints for how society should be governed. A world where tradition and myth held sway, where the whims of unseen gods were believed to dictate human fortune. In such a world, who would you turn to for answers? Who would guide kings, educate the elite, calm the anxious masses, and dare to question the very fabric of existence? This wasn't the domain of priests alone, or warriors, or even the wealthiest merchants. This was the undisputed realm of a truly unique and powerful figure, the philosopher. From the sun-drenched shores of ancient Miletus to the bustling forums of imperial Rome, from the hallowed halls of Athens to the quiet contemplation of early Christian monasteries, philosophers weren't just abstract thinkers locked away in ivory towers. Far from it. They were the architects of society, the moral compasses of their age, the scientific pioneers, and the educators of kings and emperors. They were, in essence, the rock stars of the intellectual world, commanding immense respect, fear, and admiration. But why? Why did these individuals, often armed with nothing more than their intellect than a burning desire to understand, achieve such unparalleled influence? What made them so popular, so sought after, and so deeply looked up to, when their ideas could often be profoundly challenging and even dangerous? This video isn't just a historical survey. It's an exploration into the fundamental human need for meaning, guidance, and understanding, a need that these ancient sages masterfully addressed. We'll uncover how they transformed human thought, laid the groundwork for modern science, shaped political systems, and offered profound wisdom for living a good life, a legacy that continues to resonate powerfully even in our complex world today.
Our journey begins not in Athens, but here, on the vibrant coast of Ionia, in the bustling port city of Miletus. Before the 6th century BC, if you asked, "Why does the sun rise?" or "What causes earthquakes?" the answer would almost certainly involve a god. The world was explained through myth and epic poetry. Homer and Hesiod gave us a universe run by a pantheon of powerful, passionate, and often fickle deities. Thunder was Zeus's anger. The harvest depended on Demeter's mood. These were stories that provided a framework for life, but they weren't explanations in the way we'd understand them. They were articles of faith, not products of investigation. Then, something revolutionary happened. A shift so profound it's sometimes called the Greek miracle. A handful of thinkers, whom we now call the pre-Socratics, looked at the world around them and asked a brand new, radically different kind of question. It starts with a man named Thales. Thales wasn't just a thinker, he was an engineer, an astronomer, famously and perhaps apocryphally said to have predicted a solar eclipse. But his most important contribution was a simple yet world-changing question. What is the arche? What is the single, fundamental substance from which everything else is made? His answer? Water. Now, whether he was right is irrelevant. What matters is how he arrived at this conclusion. He observed that water is essential for all life, that it can change from liquid to solid to gas, that it seems to be everywhere. He wasn't appealing to a myth or a god. He was using observation and reason. He was suggesting that the universe is not just chaotic and subject to divine whims, but is in fact an ordered, understandable system, a cosmos. His student, Anaximander, took it a step further. He argued the arche couldn't be any one known substance like water, because how could water produce its opposite, fire? He proposed something he called the operon, the boundless, the infinite, the undefined, a sort of primordial soup from which all opposites, like hot and cold, wet and dry, emerged.
And his student, Anaximenes, argued it was air, or mist, which could become fire when rarefied, and wind, clouds, water, and even earth when condensed. Again, the specific answers are less important than the method, a chain of reasoned argument and observation, each thinker building on and critiquing the last. This was the birth of natural philosophy, the ancestor of all modern science. This fire of inquiry spread. In nearby Ephesus, the famously cryptic Heraclitus looked at the world and saw constant, unending change. You cannot step into the same river twice, he claimed, because both you and the river are always changing. For him, the fundamental principle was this constant flux, this creative tension between opposites, which he likened to fire. Then, from Elea in Italy, Parmenides threw a philosophical bomb. He argued through pure deductive logic that change is an illusion. He reasoned that what is, and what is not, is not. Therefore, you can't get something from nothing, and something can't become nothing. True reality, he argued, must be one, eternal, and completely unchanging. Our senses, which show us a world of change, are deceiving us. This set up one of the greatest debates in all of philosophy. Is reality fundamentally about change or permanence? And then there was Pythagoras. We remember him for his theorem, but he was so much more. He was a mystical figure who ran a brotherhood that saw the universe in terms of numbers. He, or his followers, discovered that musical harmonies correspond to precise mathematical ratios. This led to a profound idea that the cosmos itself is a harmony, an ordered structure governed by mathematics. The world wasn't just stuff, it was structure, pattern, and ratio. So why were these pre-Socratics looked up to? Because they were the trailblazers. In a world full of superstition, they were the first to suggest that the universe was rationally understandable. They invented the very tools of logic, argument, and naturalistic observation. They weren't just asking what the world was made of. They were asking how we could possibly know. They were the original scientists, mathematicians, and metaphysicians, all rolled into one. They didn't have all the answers, far from it, but they were the first to ask the right questions. And in doing so, they created the intellectual space for the giants who would follow. They lit the fuse for the golden age of philosophy that was about to explode in Athens.
If the pre-Socratics lit the fuse, Athens was the explosion. In the 5th century BC, this single city-state became the undisputed epicenter of the intellectual world. Why? It was a perfect storm of factors. Athens had a radical new form of government called democratia, rule by the people. This meant public speaking, debate, and persuasive argument were no longer just skills, they were the keys to political power. This gave rise to the sophists, traveling teachers who charged high fees to teach rhetoric and the art of winning an argument, regardless of the truth. It was also a time of immense turmoil, most notably the devastating, decades-long Peloponnesian War with Sparta. This war, combined with a deadly plague, shattered old certainties and forced Athenians to question everything: their gods, their government, their values, and their own nature. Into this chaotic, brilliant, and desperate city stepped a man who would change philosophy forever. He wasn't rich, he wasn't traditionally handsome, and he wrote absolutely nothing down. His name was Socrates.
Socrates was a complete rupture from the past. He found the pre-Socratic obsession with what is the world made of to be a distraction. As Cicero would later put it, Socrates called philosophy down from the heavens and placed it in the cities, compelling it to ask questions about life and morals, good and evil. His entire focus shifted to ethics and human conduct. His core mission, as he saw it, was to discover the truth about concepts we throw around every day. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? And most importantly, how can we live a good life? He didn't lecture, he interrogated. This was his revolutionary tool, the Socratic method, or elenchus. He would approach a powerful general and ask, "You are a courageous man, correct? Tell me, what is courage?" The general would give a confident, common-sense answer. Socrates would then, through a series of relentless, logical questions, show the general that his definition was flawed, and that, in fact, he didn't really know what courage was at all. He famously claimed that his only wisdom was knowing that he knew nothing. His goal wasn't to humiliate, though that often happened. His goal was to act as a philosophical midwife, helping others give birth to the truth that was already within them, forcing them to critically examine their own unexamined beliefs. You can imagine why this made him complicated. The youth of Athens, like Plato, adored him. They saw him as a brilliant, fearless seeker of truth. But the political and artistic elite, they saw him as a dangerous pest, a gadfly, as he called himself, biting the lazy horse of Athens, exposing the ignorance of the powerful. And in 399 BC, after the trauma of the Peloponnesian War, Athens's patience ran out. Socrates was arrested on trumped-up charges, corrupting the youth and impiety. He could have groveled, apologized, or fled into exile. He did none of that. In his defense, he doubled down, arguing that his philosophical mission was a divine calling, and that, far from being punished, he should be rewarded by the state for his service. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. His calm acceptance of his fate, his refusal to abandon his principles even in the face of death, cemented his legacy as the ultimate philosophical martyr. Socrates' life became his final, most powerful argument.
Among the young men devastated by Socrates' execution was his most brilliant student, Plato. For Plato, the death of Socrates, the wisest and most just man he knew, at the hands of a democratic jury, was proof that Athenian society was deeply, perhaps fatally, flawed. His entire life's work became a monumental effort to answer the questions Socrates posed, and to build a philosophical system that could prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. He did this by writing, prolifically. He used his dead master as the main character in dozens of brilliant dialogues, preserving and, crucially, extending Socratic thought. To solve the problem of a world in flux, like Heraclitus, versus a world of permanence, like Parmenides, Plato proposed one of the most influential ideas in history, the theory of forms. He argued that the physical world we perceive with our senses, this chair, this tree, this act of justice, is not the real world. It's a world of imperfect, changing, etaying copies. The true reality exists in an eternal, non-physical realm of forms or ideas. There is a perfect, unchanging form of a chair, a form of a tree, and most importantly, a form of justice, a form of courage, and the ultimate form, the form of the good. We are like prisoners in a cave, he argued, mistaking shadows on the wall for reality. The philosopher is the one who breaks free, escapes the cave, and sees the true world of the forms, illuminated by the sun of the good. The philosopher's job is then to return to the cave and try to enlighten the others. This wasn't just abstract theory, it had a radical political purpose. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato designs his vision for a perfect society. And who should rule this society? Not the rich, not the popular, not the well-born. The rulers must be philosopher kings, those rare individuals who have escaped the cave, understood the form of the good, and are therefore the only ones who truly know what justice is. To create such rulers, Plato founded the Academy in Athens around 387 BC. This wasn't just a school, it was arguably the world's first university. For nearly 900 years, it was the center for studying philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and logic, a factory for forging the philosopher kings he believed the world so desperately needed.
For 20 years, the star student at Plato's Academy was a young man from the north of Greece named Aristotle. He was, without question, one of the most brilliant minds who ever lived. But he was no simple follower of his master. Where Plato was a mathematician who looked up to an abstract ideal world, Aristotle was a biologist's son who looked down and around at the messy, tangible physical world. His famous critique of Plato was simple. The forms are a nice idea, but how do they help us understand the actual dog in front of us? For Aristotle, reality is this world. If you want to understand what a dog is, you don't look to a form of dogness, you go out and observe as many different dogs as you can. You study their behavior, their anatomy, their life cycle. You classify them. And my God, did he observe! Aristotle was an encyclopedist of all human knowledge. He single-handedly invented formal logic. His syllogisms would be the basis of logic for 2,000 years. He wrote foundational works on biology, classifying hundreds of species. He wrote on physics and metaphysics, politics, analyzing 158 different city-state constitutions, ethics, rhetoric, psychology, poetics, and zoology. It's hard to find a subject he didn't touch and fundamentally shape. His ethical framework, from the Nicomachean Ethics, is still one of the most compelling ever devised. He asked, "What is the good for a human being?" His answer? Eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but better understood as human flourishing. And how do we achieve this? By living a life of virtue, which he defined as the golden mean, the rational midpoint between two extremes. Courage, for example, is the mean between the vice of cowardice and the vice of recklessness. This towering intellect, this master of all who know, as Dante would call him, wasn't just an academic. He was also a tutor to the most powerful teenager in the world, a young prince named Alexander, who would soon become Alexander the Great. While we'll never know exactly what he taught the future conqueror, the idea that the greatest mind of the age was directly shaping the greatest military leader of the age gave Aristotle a practical political prestige that was unparalleled. After leaving Alexander, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum, a rival to Plato's Academy. His students, known as the Peripatetics for their habit of walking around while they discussed philosophy, were dedicated to his empirical project, to collect, categorize, and understand everything. So, let's pull back. Why were these three in particular so revered? Socrates turned philosophy inward, making it about us, our lives, our morals, our souls. He gave philosophy its mission. Plato took that mission and built a stunning, systematic cathedral of thought, giving us a language for abstract ideas and a vision for a perfect world. Aristotle took that same mission and grounded it in the observable earth, giving us the tools of logic and the foundations of science. Together, this Athenian trio laid the complete 360-degree foundation for the next 2,500 years of Western thought. Nearly every philosopher, scientist, politician, or artist who came after them was, in some way, a footnote to Plato, as Alfred North Whitehead said, or arguing with Aristotle, or grappling with the Socratic call to know thyself. They were more than popular. They were foundational.
But the world they knew, the small, independent Greek city-state, was already dying, thanks in part to Aristotle's student Alexander. As his empires rose and shattered, philosophy would be forced to change once again, turning from the grand questions of the cosmos and the state to a more urgent personal question. In a chaotic, unpredictable world, how can I find peace?
Aristotle's student, Alexander the Great, didn't just conquer with the sword, he shattered the old world. In a single generation, he obliterated the central pillar of Greek life, the polis, the independent city-state. Suddenly, you weren't an Athenian or a Spartan first. You were just one person among millions in a vast, impersonal, multicultural empire ruled by a distant king or general. The old certainties of gods, community, and political participation were gone, replaced by chaos, constant wars, and a terrifying sense of unpredictability. The grand philosophical questions of Plato's Republic, what is the ideal state, felt abstract and out of reach. The new pressing question on everyone's mind was far more personal. How can I, a single individual, find happiness or just a little bit of peace in this vast, terrifying, and unpredictable world? This new era is known as the Hellenistic period, and it triggered a profound shift in philosophy. The goal was no longer just to understand the world, but to survive it. Philosophy became a practical guide, a form of spiritual therapy, a way of life, promising one elusive treasure: ataraxia.
3 major schools emerged, all offering different paths to this same goal. Epicureanism, the path of quiet pleasure. When we hear Epicurean today, we think of gluttony, wild parties, and lavish excess. This is a complete distortion, a smear campaign by his rivals. Epicurus was the exact opposite. He taught that the goal of life was pleasure, yes, but he defined pleasure as the absence of pain and the absence of mental disturbance, ataraxia. The real pleasures, he argued, were simple and easy to obtain: good friends, simple food, and thoughtful conversation. The way to achieve this peace was to withdraw from the world. Don't seek political power. Don't chase wealth. Don't get wrapped up in dramatic love affairs. All of these, he argued, bring far more anxiety than joy. But his most radical move was to directly attack the 2 greatest fears that plague humanity: the gods and death. On the gods, Epicurus argued, using an early atomic theory, that the gods likely exist, but they are perfect, blissful beings living in a state of ataraxia themselves. They are far too busy being happy to bother with human affairs. They don't punish us, they don't reward us, they don't answer prayers. So, stop being afraid of them. On death, his argument was a logical masterpiece. He said, "Death is nothing to us, for when we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not. You will never experience being dead, so there is absolutely nothing to fear." The appeal? Epicureanism was a balm for an anxious age. It offered a quiet, secure, and rational path to happiness, free from superstition. Stoicism, the path of the inner citadel. The second great school, Stoicism, was born in the same marketplace. Founded by Zeno of Citium, the Stoics took the complete opposite approach. Don't withdraw from the world, they said. Engage with it, but master your reaction to it. For the Stoics, the universe wasn't a random collection of atoms. It was a single, rational, divinely ordered organism, governed by logos, or divine reason. Everything that happens, everything, from a plague to a promotion, is a necessary part of this perfect rational plan. The goal is to live in accordance with nature, meaning in accordance with this logos. And how do you do that? By cultivating virtue, wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, and by understanding one of the most powerful psychological tools ever invented, the dichotomy of control. The Stoics argued that all human unhappiness comes from mistaking what we can and cannot control. You cannot control the fact that you got sick, but you can control how you respond to your sickness. You cannot control what other people say about you, but you can control whether you let it destroy your character. Your wealth, your health, your very life, these are indifference. They are not truly yours, and they can be taken at any moment. The only thing that is truly yours is your ability to choose to be a good, virtuous person right now. The appeal? Stoicism creates an inner citadel of peace. It's an armor of resilience. It's a philosophy for soldiers, slaves, and as we'll see, even emperors. It gives you a sense of invincible purpose and calm, no matter what the world throws at you.
Skepticism. The path of I don't know. Finally, there was skepticism. The skeptics, like Pyrrho, looked at the Stoics and Epicureans, who both claimed to have found the truth, and asked, "How can you be so sure?" For any argument, they said, an equally compelling counter-argument exists. Since we can never be 100% certain of the ultimate truth, the only rational response is to suspend all judgment, epike. Stop trying to find the answer. Stop worrying. Just live by your customs and conventions, but inwardly admit, I don't know. And in that admission, in that letting go of the need to be right, they found their own path to ataraxia. These weren't just academic subjects. These were all-encompassing philosophies that people lived by. They offered what religion, politics, and tradition could no longer provide, a clear blueprint for navigating the anxieties of life and a profound personal path to inner peace. Their influence was immense. But one of these philosophies, with its emphasis on duty, resilience, and inner strength, was almost perfectly designed for the next great superpower that was, at this very moment, rising in the West. As the Hellenistic kingdoms faded, the future of philosophy and the world would be written in Rome. As the Hellenistic kingdoms dissolved, a new power rose to dominate the Mediterranean, Rome. The Romans were the greatest engineers, administrators, and conquerors the world had ever seen. Their genius lay in building practical, enduring structures, from their aqueducts and laws to their armies. Culturally, however, the Romans readily admitted they were conquered by Greece. They imported Greek art, Greek gods, and, crucially, Greek philosophy. But they were pragmatic thinkers. They weren't deeply interested in Plato's abstract forms or the pre-Socratics' cosmic arguments. They wanted philosophy that worked. They sought ethical frameworks for governance, military conduct, and political stability. This is why one Hellenistic school resonated more powerfully than all others: Stoicism. Its emphasis on duty, self-control, reason, resilience, and acceptance of fate was perfectly aligned with the Roman virtues of gravitas, seriousness, and virtus, manly excellence. Cicero, the statesman-philosopher. The first great figure in Roman philosophy was not a solitary academic, but a towering politician and orator, Marcus Tullius Cicero. He saw philosophy as a necessary tool for the ruling class. Cicero's primary contribution wasn't to invent a new school, but to translate and transmit Greek thought. Writing in Latin, he made the dense Greek ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics accessible to the Roman ruling elite. He essentially created the philosophical vocabulary of the Latin language.
His writings, such as On Duties, De Offices, argued that moral and ethical duty was paramount, particularly for those in public service. He blended academic skepticism to maintain a questioning mind with the practical ethics of Stoicism, shaping the Roman ideal of the responsible, virtuous statesman.
Seneca, the moral counselor to the empire. A century later, under the early emperors, philosophy's importance continued to grow, becoming less political and more focused on personal coping. Here we find Lucius Annius Seneca, a wealthy, successful statesman, playwright, and the chief tutor and advisor to the infamous Emperor Nero. His life was a study in contradictions, immensely rich, yet preaching simplicity, powerful, yet advocating detachment. Because he lived through one of the most volatile eras of Roman imperial life, a time of insane emperors, palace intrigue, and sudden arbitrary executions, his philosophy focused on survival. Seneca's writings, primarily his moral letters to Lucilius and his essays on topics like On the Shortness of Life and On Anger, were not abstract treatises. They were practical guides on how to manage emotions, deal with loss, anticipate misfortune, and prepare for death. He gave the powerful and the wealthy the intellectual tools to maintain their inner composure, ataraxia, amidst the extreme risks of Roman life.
Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. But the highest watermark for philosophical influence was reached in the 2nd century AD with Marcus Aurelius. He was the ultimate philosopher-king, a Stoic practitioner who held absolute power over the entire Roman world. He didn't write for publication. He wrote for himself. His work, The Meditations, is a remarkable collection of private reflections, maxims, and spiritual exercises, written mostly while he was leading grueling military campaigns on the northern frontier. In this book, we see philosophy in its purest therapeutic form, the emperor reminding himself, daily, to stick to the dichotomy of control. He constantly grapples with the hardships of his role, the ingratitude of his subjects, the pain of illness, the certainty of death, and the need for justice and compassion. The appeal of the Roman Stoics wasn't just to emperors and senators, it was to everyone. For the Roman citizen, Stoicism offered a blueprint for courage and duty in the face of brutal fate. For the ruling elite, it offered an ethical foundation for good governance. Their status was unparalleled because they showed that philosophy wasn't a leisure activity, but the essential training manual for life, leadership, and survival. This immense influence carried on for centuries, even as the empire began its long, slow decline. But the next great challenge would not come from politics or war. It would come from a powerful new religious idea that would force philosophy to either submit to faith or integrate itself completely.
The philosophical journey does not end with the fall of Rome, but it faces its most profound transformation yet, the rise of a powerful new world view rooted in divine revelation, Christianity. For centuries, philosophy and religion had been separate projects. Philosophy was a journey of reason, ancient religion was a matter of ritual and tradition. But Christianity, with its structured theology, sacred texts, and universal claims, posed a direct challenge to the supremacy of Greek reason. The question for thinkers in the new millennium was stark. Should we abandon Plato and Aristotle now that we have the Gospels? Or can reason be used to support faith? Patristic philosophy, integrating reason with revelation. The integration began with the early Church Fathers, a period known as patristic philosophy. The central figure here is Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 AD. Augustine, a brilliant North African rhetorician, was initially drawn to Platonic philosophy before converting to Christianity. He became the chief architect for bridging the two worlds. He realized that Platonism, with its emphasis on an eternal, non-physical reality, the forms, and its distinction between the soul and the body was remarkably compatible with Christian ideas of God, heaven, and immortality. Augustine essentially Christianized Platonism. God became the source of all truth and the ultimate reality, replacing Plato's form of the good. His masterpieces, Confessions and City of God, used rigorous philosophical argument to defend and explain Christian doctrine, establishing a crucial precedent. Reason is the handmaiden of faith. The popularity of this approach cemented philosophy's continuing necessity. Philosophers were looked up to because they now possessed the highly specialized intellectual tools needed to defend, systematize, and make sense of the new faith. Patristic philosophy is not a finished product, but an ongoing conversation between Greek reason and Christian faith. It is a bridge that is still being crossed to this day.
The Dark Ages, Preservation and Preservation. Following the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire, much of the intellectual infrastructure of the ancient world vanished from Western Europe. Libraries were destroyed, and classical learning faded. This period is often mislabeled the Dark Ages, but it was certainly a time of intellectual contraction. During this time, the philosopher's role transformed into that of the preserver. Dedicated monks in isolated monasteries became the tireless scribes, copying and safeguarding the few classical texts that survived, including Boethius's work on logic and Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle. Crucially, this preservation was happening even more actively in the Byzantine East and the rapidly expanding Islamic world, where scholars were translating and commenting on vast quantities of Greek works, particularly those of Aristotle, who had been largely lost to the Latin West. These scholars ensured that the classical philosophical legacy would survive the turmoil. The enduring necessity of the philosopher. Even as society changed, the philosopher retained their elevated status for a simple, indispensable reason. They provided the structure of thought. For the theologian, philosophy provided the rules of logic, Aristotle's syllogisms, needed to debate, define doctrines, and organize massive theological systems. For the ruler, philosophy, in its Roman Stoic form, provided the moral framework for just governance and the ethics needed to reconcile earthly power with divine law. For the individual, philosophy provided the intellectual tools to reconcile personal experience and suffering with the ultimate truth of their faith. They were revered because they held the keys to coherence. In a world defined by the awesome, often paradoxical power of Christian revelation, the philosopher was the essential guide who could bring order to the mystery. The full intellectual explosion of this integration, the rediscovery of Aristotle, and the grand project of scholasticism would take place later, in the High Middle Ages. But the groundwork, the fusion of Greek reason with Christian faith, was laid here, ensuring that the philosopher's influence remained not just alive, but central to the intellectual life of the West.
We have traced the philosopher's journey across a millennium, from a seaside town challenging myths to the throne of an empire reconciling faith and reason. Now we must consolidate the answer. Why were these thinkers so popular, so essential, and so deeply looked up to? The reason is that, in a world that lacked our complex institutional infrastructure, the philosopher was not one thing, but all things. They were the single, powerful source addressing humanity's most fundamental needs. 1. The original scientists and cosmic explainer. Before the term scientist even existed, the philosopher was the person who took on the task of explaining the universe. The pre-Socratics liberated humanity from a world ruled by capricious gods by proposing a rational, natural order, a cosmos. They gave people the comfort of believing the world was predictable and knowable, simply by using their minds. This was empowerment on a cosmic scale. They provided the first theory of everything, laying the methodological foundations for fields like physics, mathematics, Pythagoras, and biology, Aristotle. When society wanted to understand the earth, the stars, or the cycles of life, they looked to the philosopher. 2. The moral and ethical architects. The biggest question for any ancient society was not, what is a proton, but what is a good life? The philosopher was the unchallenged authority on morality. In the absence of a unified sacred text to govern behavior, the systems of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle offered rational blueprints for virtue, justice, and human flourishing, eudaimonia. Later, the Stoics and Epicureans gave people practical, daily techniques for managing their emotions, anxiety, and fear. They were the moral guides and the first psychotherapists, offering people a profound sense of agency over their inner lives.
3. The educators of the elite and public speakers. In a world where political and economic power rested on the ability to persuade, the philosopher was the essential teacher of leaders. They didn't just teach abstract ideas, they taught the practical tools necessary for governance: rhetoric, logic, invented by Aristotle, and critical thinking, the Socratic method. If you were a wealthy family in Athens or Rome and wanted your son to become a successful statesman, he had to study philosophy. Their students were literally running the world, from Alexander the Great to Emperor Marcus Aurelius. This connection to power gave the philosopher immense prestige and direct influence. 4. The political theorists and advisors to power. When the fabric of society seemed frayed, whether by war, democracy, or empire, the philosopher was the one who could design an alternative. Plato wrote The Republic, the West's first complete blueprint for an ideal society. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero were actively in the halls of power, providing the ethical rationale for governance and the language for concepts like natural law and justice that we still use today. They were the indispensable intellectual engine behind political reform. 5. The challengers of dogma and defenders of truth. Perhaps most compellingly, the philosopher embodied intellectual courage. They were the ones willing to ask questions that were inconvenient, dangerous, or even sacrilegious. Socrates was executed for challenging established tradition. The pre-Socratics risked divine anger by proposing natural causes. This willingness to stand up to the crowd, to sacrifice comfort or even life for the pursuit of truth, is what gave them their powerful, heroic stature in the public imagination.
We began by asking why the ancient philosopher commanded such power, respect, and influence. The answer is not that they were simply smart. It's that they were indispensable. In an age of immense uncertainty, the philosopher stepped into the void, fulfilling the combined roles of the scientist, the moral leader, the political architect, and the spiritual counselor. They gave society the tools not just to survive, but to flourish. The pre-Socratics gave us the cosmos, the idea that the world is knowable by reason. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle gave us ethics and logic, the tools to build a just soul and a just society. The Hellenistic and Roman Stoics gave us resilience, the practical methods to attain inner peace in a chaotic world. Their ideas didn't just fade, they became the essential operating system for Western civilization. When you study a science, you are using the empirical method pioneered by Aristotle. When you grapple with a moral dilemma, you are participating in a conversation started by Socrates. When you try to stay calm during traffic, you are practicing a technique refined by Marcus Aurelius. Today, we have specialists for every one of their roles: physicists, ethicists, politicians, and therapists.
Yet the philosopher's central, singular challenge remains: to synthesize all that knowledge into a coherent life. To ask, how should I live? The ancient sages were looked up to because they gave humanity the greatest possible gift: agency. They taught that the greatest power does not lie in wealth or physical strength or divine favor, but in the deliberate, reasoned use of your own mind. That is the echo of ancient wisdom, and it is why, even today, their voices remain essential. What ancient philosophical idea resonates most with you? The tranquility of the Epicurean garden, or the resilience of the Stoic citadel? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey through history and thought, please like this video, subscribe for more intellectual deep dives, and hit that notification bell. Until next time, keep questioning the unexamined life.